My mom was stuck, hoist by her own petard. And so we ended up getting some Caymans. And so we had them in the basement, and they were nasty little animals. Alligators actually are quite tameable and make decent pets, but Caymans are not so tameable. And so they were bite, bite, bite all the time, but they were also fascinating. And that really accelerated my interest in herpetology.
So today we're on with Jonathan Losos. Did I say that correctly?
Losos.
Losos.
Yes.
Okay, so he told me wrong. He's like, because I'm bad with names. Don't ask me how that works.
It looks like Losos, so I understand why people pronounce it that way, and I answer almost anything.
So can you explain who you are, what you do, and some of the books you've written?
Sure. So my name is Jonathan Losos. I'm a professor of biology here at Washington University. I am an evolutionary biologist. So I study how species evolve and adapt to their circumstances. And I've spent my career studying lizards of the genus Anolis, like this guy here in the calendar. They're found in Florida and the southeastern United States and throughout the Caribbean and Central and South America. And there are 400 species of them. So I've studied how they've evolved and how they've adapted each species to its own particular part of the environment. More recently, I've become interested in scientific research on domestic cats. Cats have done all kinds of fascinating things from their ancestors. And even today, understanding why they do what they do is an interesting question evolutionarily. So that's who I am. I've written 2 books for a popular audience. I don't have one in front of me. I have one of them in front of me, the recent book, The Cat's Meow, How Cats Have Brought the Savannah to Your Sofa. And the previous book was called Improbable Destinies. It was about how evolution works. So that's who I am.
That's incredibly interesting, man. I have so much to say, but we're trying to focus on you because I could go off on thousands of tangents. I study on the side neuroscience of reptiles right now.
Cool.
And I accidentally mistook a brain of a house cat for a brain of an iguana.
That shows the connection, lizards and cats.
Like, it's so far. Somebody asked a while back, they were like, okay, so, when did the lizards and snakes evolved apart? I'm like, well, if you go far enough back, people and snakes come from the same, all vertebrates have the same brain. It's just mapped differently.
Absolutely.
It's wild. So we're going to get into a lot of stuff here, but how do you see evolution? What is it defined as? Because it's a very interesting question.
Well, there's lots of different definitions of evolution. If you look it up online or in a dictionary, you'll find these long, complicated definitions. But really the simple one, well, you go back to Darwin, what he defined it as is simply descent with modification, or how species change through time. And I think that's the essence of evolution. It's how one species evolves into multiple species and how they change or how they don't change over time.
Yeah, because I've started to explain to people, I think it's a bad idea to see it as survival.
Yes, and so that raises a very good point. People often confuse or confound natural selection with evolution. Now, one way that evolution occurs is if natural selection operates, if individuals with certain traits survive better or have more offspring than individuals with other traits, then that population will evolve. But natural selection is not evolution. It's a mechanism by which evolution can occur.
Okay. Yeah, I explain to people, because I'm a physics major. I was a physics major and stuff. So it's like when we look at how things are measured, and it's like you're not measuring it by survival. You're measuring it by how things are used. And so it's like you can't really, it's really fascinating. You are very fascinating to look up. Literally, I tell people this guy, and we were just talking about it before. You there was a guy a buddy of mine at work was talking about giving a talk, and you actually on your book, and you came to his talk. And the fact that you're even here on my podcast talking to me is such a sign of a good professor.
Well, thank you. I think, number one, I really enjoy talking to people about science. And I also think that we scientists have a duty not only to do research and learn things, but to help disseminate that information to the public. And so I'm happy to do this.
Well, it sounds like you're really like able to get across more complex things just by the simple talk that we've already had, just listening to you. Because a lot of this stuff is very complex, but yet we can simplify it in a way that most people can understand.
Well, I certainly agree with you, but I also think that the sort of work that I do is easier than, for example, what you do with neuroscience. I mean, that's really complicated in talking about molecules and hormones and all these kinds of things. I mean, people understand what a lizard is or what a cat is. And so I think I do have an advantage. I really respect people like you who can make what you do understandable to the general public.
I don't know if I do, but I'm trying to. I'm working on being a better presenter of what I do, because I come from a background of I wanted to study empathy, and my brother's neurodivergent. He's actually autistic. So if you study both of those, you can actually get a really interesting look at actually how empathy works in the human brain. And so then when I look at reptile brains, it changes the way I look at that. And it changes how we listen to people talk too. I've done studies on that, and listening, like I said, just by listening to you talk, you could see you're a better professor. Most professors, it's about, I'm wanting to be the smartest. I am the smartest person in the room. I hate that. I hate being that. So it's like, it's very interesting. I love it. And the way the guy talked, that you came to it, you were so gracious about talking to it. It's wonderful. But the way I describe you, you literally did things that we tell people not to do. Like, so can you talk about your childhood, how you got started? Because that's an interesting story too.
With the Caymans.
Yes.
So I was one of those little boys or little children who was fascinated by dinosaurs. And I had my basket full of plastic dinosaurs when I went to nursery school. I still have them. It's a great time to be a plastic dinosaur guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was interested in prehistoric reptiles. And then I transitioned to becoming interested in living reptiles. And then one day, cool. I recognize that.
It's a death mold.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. One day I was watching a television show, which sadly people today haven't heard of, called Leave It to Beaver. Have you heard of Leave It to Beaver?
I'm old enough, yes.
All right, but ask your students. Most of them haven't heard of it. Anyway, this is a TV show from the 1950s. It was already in reruns when I was young. And the young boy called the Beaver gets a baby alligator from a local alligator farm. And then all kinds of hijinks ensue. I thought that was a great idea. And I was aware that pet stores at that time sold caimans, which are a South American relative of the alligator. You could buy one for $10. They were small. And so I asked my mother, can I have a caiman? Now, my mother was the type of woman who did not like to say no. So instead, she thought she would outfox me. And she said, let's ask the deputy director of the St. Louis Zoo, who was a family friend. And she was expecting that he would put the kibosh on the idea. And so I bugged my father for weeks and weeks. And finally, one day he comes home and says, I spoke to Mr. Hessel, and he said, it's a great idea. That's how he got his start in zoology. And so my mom was stuck, hoist by her own petard. And so we ended up getting some caimans. And so we had them in the basement, and they were nasty little animals. Alligators actually are quite tameable and make decent pets, but caimans are not so tameable. And so they were bite, bite, bite all the time, but they were also fascinating. And that really accelerated my interest in herpetology.
I am not a professor. I am not in academia. I work for Bayer Crop Science right now. I have a bachelor's. I couldn't afford to go to grad school. That's the only reason why I didn't go, because I got into grad school studying cancer cells and learning how to target them with polymers. But I've always loved neuroscience, and it's the only thing I would ever even go back to school for. And we'll get into a little more of that towards the end.
Okay, sounds good.
But you also did your study where you actually released anoles. Can you talk about that? Because we tell people not to release things into the wild. What was the ethics on that? How did that come about? What did you find in that study that you didn't, maybe not published, but you would like to see more research done for that?
So let me see if I have a little anole here somewhere. Well, here's one. Not the most, actually it's anatomically not that bad. It's a stuffed animal.
Yeah.
But this is an anole. Their most obvious feature is they have this little throat structure called a dewlap that they can stick out. And that's what the males do when they're courting females and so on. And there are, as I said, there are 400 species of this type of lizard. So they've been the study organism I've spent my career studying. One of the things that I learned early on in my research was that when you look across the 400 species, those species that are found on broad surfaces, like tree trunks, have long hind legs. And species that use narrow surfaces, like twigs, have very short legs. And when we look at the evolutionary tree of how species are related, we can see that leg length has evolved many times. And in particular, the ancestral condition is having longer legs, and then having short legs has evolved many times when species transition to using narrower surfaces. We've also done mechanical studies where we get lizards to run on different surfaces. And what we find is that on a broad surface, longer lizards can run faster because they can take longer strides. On a narrow surface, however, long legs aren't an advantage, and in fact, they are a disadvantage because when they're trying to grab the narrow surface with the long legs, they're very ungainly, and sometimes they simply miss and go falling off the twig. And so, in other words, long legs are an advantage for running fast on broad surfaces. Short legs are advantageous for navigating on narrow surfaces. So all of this evidence, this association between limb length and the breadth of the surface they use, and the fact that there are advantages in terms of what the lizards can do, it all suggests that lizards adapt to using different surfaces by evolving differences in their leg length. However, there's a saying, and that saying is correlation does not prove causation. Just because there's an association between how long the legs are and how broad the surface is, it doesn't mean that the surface caused them to evolve the legs. And that's why in the science in general, the gold standard is to do an experiment where you can specifically test the idea you have to see if it holds true or not. Now, traditionally, people have not tried to do experiments on evolution because everyone knows that evolution takes much too long. It's a very slow process. And so why do an experiment that would take 1,000 years to get a result? But in recent years, scientists have realized that idea is wrong, that actually evolution can occur very rapidly when conditions change. In other words, when natural selection strongly favors a new trait, evolution occurs very rapidly. And so what that means is that it is possible to actually do experiments to expose a population to new conditions and see if they adapt to those conditions. And so that's what we did working in the Bahamas. Now, the reason we did this in the Bahamas is that in many places in the Bahamas, there are very small islands the size of my room, or maybe a couple times the size of my room, which is just a normal office. Maybe about the size of a baseball infield. So not very big islands. And these islands often don't have lizards on them. But if you look just over there, 100 yards away, there will be a bigger island that has a type of Anolis lizard, the brown anole, it's called. And sometimes the brown anoles get to these small islands, and when they get there, they do fine. But occasionally a hurricane comes along, and the high water from the hurricane wipes the lizards off the island. So many of the islands are empty simply because the lizards got washed away. And so we used those islands as test tubes. And basically what we did was we took lizards from a nearby island, big island with big trees, caught the lizards, put them on the small island where they had to use narrow vegetation because these small islands don't have much vegetation. And our prediction is that since they're now having to use narrow surfaces, they would evolve short legs to adapt. So this is a way of testing whether that association, that correlation we'd observed actually is causal, whether surface diameter affects limb evolution. And what we found is absolutely yes, that is what happens, that within a few generations, a few years, the lizards evolved to have shorter legs. And so that's how we were able to do an evolution experiment to test the idea that we had developed from looking at many different species. Now you ask about the ethics of this, and in some sense it sounds bad. We're putting lizards on islands that they don't occur on naturally, but this is mimicking a process that goes on all the time. We didn't bring in a species from thousands of miles away or even hundreds of miles away. We brought in a species that lives 100 yards away. And we've also shown that naturally they can colonize these islands. They can float across the water, and it happens all the time. And so although I think that the general concern is certainly valid, in this case, I don't think there are any ethical problems with what we did. And in fact, that most of our island populations have been wiped out by subsequent hurricanes.
And what I always bring up to people is that your studies there are some of the most important studies for island evolution that's ever been done. Like
there's been a lot of studies, so that's very high praise, and I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think that they're nice studies, and they're one of the early studies showing that you can do experiments on evolution in nature, and it's a very powerful tool that we're just now taking advantage of.
I actually knew about that study before I knew who you were because of PBS. And like that, you blow in the lizard with the leaf blower and stuff. But I actually I did on the medulla. I did going into like what studies that we would like to done next. I would love to study the Anolis medullas that change like that. I would love to study the Galapagos Island iguanas because of their mandullas, because we know hormones are there, and that has to have an impact. Something that I saw in the medulla is really interesting because there was a study done in France where you got to see the brains. If you ever find a 4D model, it's their study. It's them. They put out that 4D model using the study. I have problems with the study, but there's more studies from that I think we could actually improve on that study with and go into the thalamus. I think the thalamus is one of the most important things of the brain. I think that's why they are so dramatically different than us. But one of the things that I'd like to see is studying that medulla of those. And I think we could actually get funding for that because of the medical research that could actually lead to kind of understanding more of our hormones and what we might actually do medically to affect our hormones in a way that actually fixes some of the problems that we have in humans. And because it's so hard to get funding. So I think that's one of the reasons why the Galapagos Island medulla is so important. And then studying your anoles is also important there. But also from their study, what I saw, species that actually have, like, they like to bury themselves, that actually like to have, that like even in rock systems, their medulla crinkles more. There's more like a curve to it. The ball python has more of a kink and then automatically goes out, whereas the rainbow boa has it slightly and then goes out. Because when you look at the flying squirrel that has actually stretched its foreskin, it's got this massive long medulla, which it probably needs to be mobile. But also that more information just is probably making that medulla grow because of all that excess. But you don't see that in the diagrams of anole brains, because they don't have the two. It's like an overloading of the senses that has created that medulla to stretch, and there's nowhere for it to stretch, so it wrinkles and actually creates a crease, I believe. That study did not find that mathematically, but they did find the cerebellum is the only thing when you break it down to 5 different species. Or 5 different things: limbless, reduced limb, quadrupeds, tutorial, arboreal, and tutorial, and then quadrupeds multiple. And then like snakes, their optic tantrum, their medullas or their cerebellums do this, while all quadrupeds, their optic tantrum, actually their cerebellum wraps around it. Very fascinating, and it's thicker the more you go down. So there is actually something possibly to that, and I think that's very fascinating. A study that we could do in the lab on ball pythons is actually allow them to escape from an enclosure, and then do the same with rainbow boas or something, and allow them to escape. Test that, move the enclosure completely to see if they do it again, and how they do it, how they're feeling it out, because they should have more tactile functionality because of that. And so then what you do is you take the same size enclosure and you make it completely out of acrylic to where they can't see it. And then you want to feel it and see if they can actually escape that. I think that would be a great study. What we see in anoles is that anoles, I know I should be letting you talk because you're amazing, but going back to anoles is I've seen anoles, my bearded dragons in almost every single species can't understand glass. So anoles also hit the glass, but the anoles will also walk to the glass and jump on it.
Good point. Good point.
Do you know why that is? Think about how they attach.
Yes.
So they're attaching molecularly.
Right.
In my head, I'm like, they're feeling it molecularly, so they're seeing the world differently through a molecular lens that other reptiles don't.
That's an interesting idea. It never occurred to me, but you're absolutely right. Of course, it would be interesting. Geckos do the same thing.
Yes.
So there's your comparative test, compared geckos and anoles.
A buddy of mine says that his gecko, his crested gecko, been on the glass for like 13 years. He changed up the enclosure, and then it attached to the glass again in a completely new enclosure where it had more space, and that because it was comfortable with glass. And so it felt the glass still. So it was probably like, okay, this is what I know. This is what I felt, because we don't actually think about these animals and their tactile senses. We don't really try to put ourselves in their shoes. But like I said, empathy things. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's something we could actually do in the laboratory. So it's something that I think like that. What are some studies that you think are needing to get done that you want to do next, and what studies are you doing now?
Well, one study we've been trying to do for quite a long time is another one of these experiments on small islands where we've tried to study the effect of predators on where the lizards, what part of the habitat the lizards, the anoles, occupy, and then how they adapt to that. And in particular, again, we've taken these small islands, and this time a little bit larger islands that naturally have the brown anole on them, and we place on half of the island, randomly selected which ones, a local predator called the curly-tailed lizard. And this is a larger lizard that occurs primarily, almost entirely on the ground. It's somewhat similar to a bearded dragon a little bit. Not as big, but that sort of animal. And it eats brown anoles. And so you put these predators in, and the brown anoles are no dummies. They immediately shift up into the vegetation and greatly reduce their use of the ground. And so that forces them to use the narrow surfaces on the up in the bushes. And so now we want to see, will this eventually lead them to adapting to a very different lifestyle up in the bushes? And we actually started this experiment for the first time 20 years ago now, but our islands keep getting hit by these hurricanes, which basically stop and sometimes destroy the experiment. And we've learned a lot about the effect of hurricanes, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But would really like this experiment to be able to move along far enough to see what happens. So that's kind of the exciting big experiment going on at the moment.
That's cool. What are maybe some of the things that you might have seen? Because what I find incredibly interesting when talking to people is seeing what they may have saw and then not like talked about because of, for whatever reason. It's so interesting. You get some really cool answers. One vet was talking about some of her geckos. If you put them together, they will gain and lose weight the exact same. When if you separate them, they don't. It's really fascinating how that actually like plays out. So it's always that. What are some of the like maybe things that you might not have published, but that you thought of that may just be like just one-off thoughts that you're like, maybe I just like, okay.
So let me answer this a little bit sideways, because there's a great example of what you're talking about having to do again with these Anolis lizards. And I pointed out that they have this structure, the dewlap, and the males will do these displays when they're courting females. Yeah. And also when two males are having an aggressive encounter, they kind of go like this and they push themselves up and they stick their dewlaps out. But it also happens that sometimes when you walk up to one of these anoles, it starts doing that to you. And I had seen that for many times and just thought to myself, well, stupid lizard, why is it doing that to me? It's just something wrong with the hardwiring, something that you need to figure out what's going on. And it turns out just everyone who's done field work on these lizards had observed the same thing and never thought much about it. And then some number of years ago, someone who was at that time a student, he's now a professor at the University of Missouri, Manuel Leal, he thought to himself, well, maybe they're actually trying to communicate to the predator. Even though a predator is much larger than the anole, maybe they're displaying to the predator for a reason. And so basically he did some studies, and what he showed was basically the anole is saying to the predator, number one, saying, I see you, don't waste your time chasing me because I'm going to run away. But also, the more they do this, indicates how much endurance they have. And so if they do it a lot, they say, look, I got plenty of energy. You're never going to catch me. And if you do catch me, I'm going to bite you on the nose and you won't be able to swallow me. Go look for someone else. And so it was actually an honest signal of the lizard's capability of escaping. And so this was not a mistake or a problem. The lizards had intentionally evolved this behavior to deal with predators. And so it was a cool study, but it just showed you, I had seen that, everyone had seen it, and no one had thought much of it. Yeah. Until Manuel came along and showed that actually it's very important.
I have a bearded dragon named Pitch. Pitch the bitch is her name.
Okay.
She's very intelligent. She's named because she would arm wave when I first got her, and I didn't know that was a submissive move, but I have seen her arm wave a cricket before she ate it. Interesting. And she's super intelligent. I take them to the lake, and we were driving past the off-ramp to go to the lake. So it's a light, and you can't see the lake. And she goes, well, yeah. What all this shows you is the importance of just being observant and paying attention to what you see, and like to watch what animals do in their natural environment and think about it and follow up and be curious. The mountain horn dragons, we started talking to somebody, and we know that human beings have ego in the actual brain. It's a neurological thing. It's not actually just psychology. It's actually a neurological condition. When people die and they come back in hospitals, they lose it. Huh. So it's like anything that is neurological in a human is possible in a reptile. Doesn't mean it is, but it's possible. And it's very interesting going back to what you were saying with the dewlap and the head bobbing of the predator. We take for granted that the animals here see us as part of their group, that they can. My big bearded dragon thinks he's second in command of all my reptiles. And he will go after anything that is on the ground except for my savanna monitors. If he sees it on the ground, he's upset. I'm head bobbing. I'm mad. And then what he does is, if I have it on me, like I can get right up to him with another beardy, nothing. because I'm second in command. And so we know that allowing them to have their ego and to feel dominance actually has a potential to help with breeding. So when we talk about the Anolis or the mountain horn dragons, I explained that they probably should be up higher when you're breeding them, and they should probably look down to you because that allows them to have more of the ego, allows them to feel more dominant. And so then you're more likely to get them to breed because they can access that part of their brains. Skinks, we see that the Peter-banded skinks and a lot of the skinks, the fire skinks and all of them, they will come out and stay out into the light when they're sick and dying. That is the number one way to tell if your skink is about to die. It will stay out all day in the sun. I believe that part of the brain, don't like, you can quote me, but I believe that part of the brain is like changing like it does when we die. And so that's making them like want to come out and heal in the sun, and or they stop caring about their survival because they lose the ego. And so I believe that's correct. Don't quote me on that one, or don't quote me on that one. I think it's a very interesting thing, but I'm not the only one that saw that. It's very fascinating.
Oh, that is, I agree.
Yeah, and I figured you would get a kick out of that. So what are some of the things that you might want to actually look for in grad students? Because you have, like, what is your department? What are some of the grad classes that you actually have for students? Because University of Washington in St. Louis is actually one of the top schools in the country. I have seen by accident, I've seen your office, and I'm so massively impressed. I didn't even get to go inside, and it's like there's a massive window in the hall to your office, and it's like I've never seen an office like that before. You guys actually do have one of the highest qualities that I've seen in any school around.
Well, we've long had a very strong program in ecology and evolution. And so graduate students here, we have advanced courses on various aspects of evolution, such as population genetics, molecular evolution, macroevolution, and advanced courses in ecology, community ecology, disease ecology, and so on. So we have a variety of different advanced courses. In addition, the graduate students do what we call rotations, where they work in several different labs for 3 or 4, maybe 6 months each, learning the techniques that lab uses and also the questions that lab addresses. And so the idea is that these rotations are an alternative to classroom instruction, another way to learn about how research in this area is done. And so students will do several rotations, and then they will settle down into one laboratory to do their PhD research. So students that we look for are, to apply are, of course, students who've done well as undergraduates, or sometimes they've got a master's degree already, so have a good record of classroom grades. Students, it's really useful for students to have experience doing research so that they have a track record of finding research interesting and being able to get the job done, and hopefully having good recommendations from the people they've worked with. And usually, so in our graduate program, usually students who apply have a pretty good idea of what they want to study, what topic, what general topic, and perhaps what type of organism, as opposed to, say, molecular biology, where most graduate students only have a very broad, very, very broad idea, and that's what the first years of graduate school are about, is finding out what they want to do. But people interested in nature, in ecology and evolution, usually have a pretty good idea of what they want to study when they start graduate school. And so I look for people who are interested in either in studying the organisms that people in my lab study, which has primarily been lizards, although maybe cats in the future, or who want to study the questions we ask, how species evolve to adapt to new circumstances, and so on. So I've had people in my lab who work on fish but do the same sort of studies we do with lizards. But so either it has to be the right organism or the right type of question. I like to tell people, because this has happened a few times, I've had people contact me about doing graduate work with me studying marine mammals. And it's like, why would you come to St. Louis to my lab to study marine mammals? It's not the questions, it's not the organism. But so anyway, that's what I look for in a graduate student.
That's cool. It's very interesting. Like I said, the iguana brain and the cat brain. I want to do an episode where I bring somebody on that understands behaviors of iguanas, and then I can explain a lot of the behaviors of cats, because I grew up with a lot of feral cats and stuff. And as you can see, I do notice a lot more than a lot of people do. Yeah. And it's very interesting. Do you know anything about like the smooth brain? What they talk about like that either? No, I don't really either, but I think one of the biggest things is that the cats are mammals, and so their brains are capable of that wrinkling, whereas most reptiles have to have that knowledge ahead of time. It's like, so we know DNA holds memory, so why does the cheetah have to learn to hunt while the sea turtle automatically knows? But then it's when we look at autism, we know that autistic people have a growth in the brain, like really autistic, before the age of 2. So they don't build the pathways like normal people might, because it's already blocked. So it's a struggle for them. So that's kind of where we come into reptiles, and why I often compare reptiles to autism, because it's going to be probably a lot harder to teach them than it would a cat. But a cat might actually find more joy in the cruelty of something else than an iguana might. But the iguana might actually find it harder to find joy in the happiness of something else as well, where a cat can. So it's very fascinating to think. It's why I would tell people, like, an iguana probably, even if they get mean, they probably not cruel. Whereas a cat, you might be able to see it as cruel, but yet kind of, it's
hard to know. When you start using terms like cruel, it's like, well, what does that do to a cat?
Yeah, when you look at things as bad and good, it's like it takes away a lot of that. It
Agreed.
Takes away of understanding.
Right, because they don't have morality, and you can't put our senses, our terms onto them.
I actually believe that the thalamus, like I said, the thalamus is the key to a lot of it, because we can understand that their brains activate a lot of the same ways. So an iguana, the brain that I saw of the iguana actually has the thalamus, the white matter, going up between the optic tantrum and the forebrain. But most reptiles are underneath. The bearded dragon looks almost identical brain to the iguana, except that thalamus is only underneath. And I think that shortens, and I think that allows for faster connections between the forebrain and the optic tantrum. And I think Anolis will have less of that, maybe, but maybe not, because what's interesting is I've seen my emerald swifts. So they'll be here and the other one's here. They're in the exact same posture. This one jumps because I scared it. These two jump in the exact same way. And that's in the optic tantrum, that's actually a piece of modeling that we have in our brain. So it's really fascinating. And since they're a social species, I wonder if more social species have more thalamus between those parts of the brain, unlike a bearded dragon.
That would make sense.
It would, right?
Yep.
That's why I tell people, like, the thalamus, the thing that isn't studied, is probably one of the most important things to study.
So I want to segue on a tangent of something you said a few minutes ago. One of the things that has surprised me has to do with cats and hunting, and how they learn to hunt, and how they learn to specialize on one sort of prey if they do that. And it turns out there's been surprisingly little research on that. There is some evidence that what a mother hunts will affect what her offspring will hunt, and that they do learn from their mother. But on the other hand, cats raised without mothers and without being taught to hunt at all, some of them learn how to hunt quite effectively. And really, we just don't understand the development of hunting abilities and why some cats end up being able to hunt in some ways and other cats in other ways. And it's one of these things, in theory, it wouldn't be that hard to do. It would take a lot of work, but people just haven't done that sort of research.
And I think this stuff is so underappreciated and utilized. And there's just not a lot of money probably in doing it. That's why I talked about the thalamus and like how important that studies could be to other factors that would actually bring in money. But it's really interesting. I saw a video on the T-Rex. They were talking about the skull and why the eyes are so small on the T-Rex. They're a lot smaller than you would think, but the whole head itself needs to be so large to take in for the jaw strength. Otherwise, it would crack the skull.
Yeah.
But all I can see is a reptile brain inside that head. Since I've been studying it, it's like all I can see is that. And I just think about that OL stalk, the oral stalk, actually stretching out farther. And I can just think of that T-Rex. And we know from our personal experience that that OL stalk leads us to a memory because it goes straight into our forebrain, which is where memory is held. And so that OL stalk in that T-Rex, it's like, do they lick things? Can they open their mouths? And does that actual information come in and they use it? Because you know that OL stalk was huge. It's just what percentage was it in the T-Rex brain? But then thinking about how that is used while they eat something, are they going, oh, wow, this reminds me of the time of the meal I had that my mother bit the head off of the animal? Like, it's like, that's my thought. Like, oh, does the T-Rex, does it think like that? Because that's not that far-fetched.
Yeah, true.
It's so interesting to kind of go, wow. And yeah, it's anthropomorphizing. What do you think of anthropomorphizing? Because that is anthropomorphizing, but is it wrong?
Well, I think it's one of these things that you need to be careful that you have to acknowledge when you're projecting human qualities onto an animal. But on the other hand, it certainly makes ideas very clear and understandable. That, when we talk about people, there's a lot of research these days on the personality of animals, that animals, just like people, you and I and everyone else have different personalities. It's true of animals too. But sometimes the researchers say, well, this is a bold lizard and this is a cautious lizard. And it's people understand what that means, but yet you have to be careful, because they're not bold in the sense we're bold. They're just expressing these behaviors. So I think anthropomorphism is, it's not something you shouldn't ever do, but you just need to be careful or just need to explain that. We're not saying that they're little people thinking in the same way, but yeah, as an analogy more than saying it's equivalent.
Yeah. So it's very interesting that way, because it's like everybody automatically wants to jump there. Oh, well, you're just anthropomorphizing. It's like, am I? Because I'm actually thinking of it from a neurological standpoint. Yeah. It's like, I am. But yet it's how we can actually understand. It's very interesting. And I really appreciate, I know that you need to go within probably 10 minutes.
About 8 or 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any questions for me or anything? Any thoughts?
Well, my first question is, how did you get started in this?
Reptiles or this?
Doing these sort of interviews.
I literally thought to myself, there's nobody studying. I love neuroscience. I've been like in the back of my head doing this for a while and like just, but there's nobody doing empathy, studying the empathy of people. And so then, so it's like, what's the empathy of people in the reptile community? And I have learned that the putting yourself in other people's shoes is a piece of empathy, but that's actually imagination because it's in the same side of the brain. I'm actually even getting even further. I have a very visual imagination. So when I hear something, I see it and feel it because of the way my childhood was. So I have a family therapist on, and he just thinks like this is like he's never thought about it in this terms. But I see it also from like, okay, this is what the neuroscience people say. So it's like, okay. And then I'm listening to this guy talk about these reptiles, about them being confident and comfortable and things like that. It's like, yes, when we see animal abusers, they never talk like that.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay. And actually, animal rights people, you almost never hear them talk like that.
Interesting.
When you actually listen to somebody go that, and it's like, so this guy has massive empathy. So I asked him, do you have the internal sight like I do? Do you see it in your head? And he's like, no. So it's very interesting. So how does his imagination work? His imagination isn't sight. That the guy, the teacher, we were talking about this, and he said, oh, well, when you talk to people like that and they go, oh, well, when I read, I don't see it in my head. I hear it as a voice, which is super fascinating to me. So their imagination is different. So that's kind of how I got into the studying this stuff. And then as I grow and I want to pull away, I want to get away from this breeder, everything, you know, if all the morphs and stuff, and see these animals for what they actually are, living, breathing creatures with actual thoughts. It's really very, very interesting, and it could actually help breeding processes as well. Like I said, allowing them to have that comfort and confidence and understanding that naturalistic behavior a little bit more. And just there's just so much out there. And how do I get it across? So I want to do game shows. I literally want to bring on somebody like you and somebody else and be like, okay, so here's the bearded dragon brain. Here's all the pieces. This is what all the pieces should like do. This is what they're attached to. Okay, here's another brain. Can you tell me what you know, any part that's different that you see? What does that mean? And each one of those is a point. Can you tell me if it's a turtle, a lizard, a snake? And then if you can tell me the exact species, that's 3 points. And the goal is to actually end up with the audience going, oh, I know that answer. I know that answer. I know that answer. Like a murder mystery. So they will actually find more self-esteem in science. How do you do that? How do you raise your students' self-esteem to want to be in science more? What do you do?
Well, I think the idea is to make it interesting to them, make it fascinating. And, you know, you can make almost any topic boring if just by being really dull. But of course, the advantage of talking about animals is they're inherently fascinating. So just playing up all the interesting aspects of them to illustrate the concepts you're teaching, I think that's the key. So that's certainly in my classes what I try to do.
Yeah, and you have students. You say you want students that are here to learn, that are really students, not just somebody wanting to look at pretty things. Yeah, it's like that, and that's a different audience than an actual regular person. Did you know Alan Turing, or not? Maybe not Alan Turing. I'm trying to think. The guy from MASH,
Alan Alda.
Alda, yes. Yeah. You know he actually has a school for communicating science?
I do know that. They do fantastic things.
See, I want to take some of his classes so I could actually do that.
I've heard that they're wonderful things. I wonder if they're available online.
They are. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Check it out.
Yeah, so I find that very fascinating, and you know, I really appreciate you coming on. Like, this really is a sign of, like I told the lady, it's like nobody would come on my podcast that's a psychopath. So you don't have to really worry that they're psychos. It's like you don't like, no, that's not how that goes. And you seem like a really fun person. How do you see that coming off to your classes? Like,
well, I do. When I get my reviews from students every semester, they usually remark on my enthusiasm for a topic. And I'm fortunate that I get to teach classes about topics that I'm really interested in. And so it's fun. I like telling students about these things and trying to get them interested. And so I think that comes through in my teaching.
Great. Send a grad student my way once in a while. See if them to talk to me, because I would love to keep up with the new stuff that's going on, new understandings and things that are just because it's so fascinating. Like I said, it really did help us understand a lot of island biology, even like just a deeper understanding, because you're willing to ask those questions that nobody else is asking and willing to do the stuff that you're probably not supposed to do.
Yeah, no, we follow the rules. We follow the rules.
And that's the thing.
It is fun just going out and learning new stuff. And that's the thrill of science. And, some of the things we learn, 5 people in the world care about it, but still we learn something new. And you stumble across stuff that is more broadly interesting. So that's certainly the thrill of science.
I don't think enough people understand what some of this stuff implication is. My study on empathy has really helped me to understand Patrick Mahomes from the Kansas City Chiefs and Andy Reid and Einstein and what's his name? Did Alien, the original one, Ridley Scott. All of those people have probably more empathy. That's how Patrick Mahomes is so good as a Kansas City Chiefs. He talks about seeing the field, and he can empathize with the other players so he can put themselves in their shoes. Einstein actually did the same thing. Duncan, the experimentation that he would do. And so we see that the versatility of this is so massive, but yet people just want to go, oh, well, empathy just means you're a better person. No, it's a tool. It's not about being a better person. It is a tool. And once you learn to use it, it has implications beyond anything you can imagine right now. And it's very fascinating. And so this is what your studies do, just in a different field.
Well, that's very cool.
It is.
Yeah.
I appreciate you. I think you got to go.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got to run to a meeting. That's the bane of being a professor. All these meetings all the time. But
oh God, yeah. Business world's the same thing.
Yeah,
it sucks.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Well, good luck with all you're doing, and I look forward to seeing what happens in the future.
Me too. And I enjoy looking at more of your research. I want to. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.